Thank you for joining us. This is the video supplement to the 24D seismic for onshore carbon storage monitoring e-poster. I'm Lee Hunt. My co-authors are Eric Street, Graham Hack, Jason Schweigert, and Matthew Allen. This is really the second part in a series. We had a previous poster called Theseus. 24D is an element of the Theseus thinking. It's about saving capital and environmental footprint in the seismic elements of carbon storage monitoring. And 24D in particular does this through integrating 2D and 3D seismic. And it's kind of a funny idea because it reverses the historical course of seismic development by going from 3D to 2D instead of 2D to 3D. And we'll explain why this is desirable and possible. Essentially, in this talk, we're going to lay out this problem and show an experiment that exhibits some evidence that this is indeed a thing that is quite possible to do and that we should feel optimistic can be done. So we'll start with a review of Theseus in 24D. It'll be very brief. Then we'll move on to setting up this 3D model experiment that I briefly mentioned. So we're going to try to provide evidence that this concept that we have can in fact work. We'll show you those experimental results and then we'll sum up. So in summary, Theseus and 24D are about an idea like parsimony in monitoring for carbon storage. The problem here is that the seismic elements of MMV can cost a lot. It can cost up to 50% of all MMV costs, which turns out to be quite a lot. Now, we would like to achieve the goals of MMV. We don't want to cut corners. We want to achieve those goals for less capital and for less disturbances of the surface. And this takes us to today's idea, which we call kind of the endpoint or the extreme endpoint of Theseus, which is total 24D, where repeat 3D is entirely eliminated in favor of repeat 2D. Now, in order for something like this to work and meet all the goals of MMV, there has to be a way of producing flexible 2D baselines from the baseline 3D. And we'll show you what we mean by that. So first, 24D in pictures. What we're showing in this slide is basically 3 decades and more of monitoring, all in one picture. So, series of boxes here. The first one on the upper left is a picture showing you an idea of a baseline 3D, or we'll call it a baseline 24D survey, in which the 3D and 2D are entirely embedded in the same experiment. So, the yellow star is the injector well. The blue concentric circles are a model of the CO2 plume through time. This is a transient analytical model. The numbers represent time indexes. Each index counts 5 years, so 1 is 5 years in and 6 is 30 years in. So we're modeling this entire plume. The green area that we see is the baseline 3D area that we start with. It contains in 24D these 2D lines. And this is the key and most important seismic we'll ever shoot is our baseline. Now, what happens after that at successive time periods 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 is we see the plume in blue grows through each of these. It gets bigger, and we have a series of repeat native 2D lines. That just means 2D lines that are shot as 2D lines that get larger for every time index, as they must, to map this CO2 plume and monitor it as it grows. We show for a star pattern of 4 2D lines, but it could be 14 lines, it could be 6 lines. They might not be symmetric. We just show 4 here to be representative. Okay, so that's the concept. And we have shown in previous work that if this were to work, if you were to actually make that happen, we would reduce at closure the surface disturbances by almost entirely, by 96%. And our capital costs would be reduced by about 57% or thereabouts. And if you want to look at the evidence to back up where we come up with these numbers, in our stack for the e-poster, there are 2 journal papers, and we'll show how we came up with those numbers. But the thing to bear in mind, and the purpose of this paper, is that these savings, they're kind of a truth claim. They assume that we can actually pull off the integration of this 2D and 3D, this 24D idea, that it'll work from a baseline that costs no more than a regular baseline would cost, and that it would indeed fulfill all the needs of MMV. So it's really the purpose of this talk to show that such a thing is possible, and in fact, how might it best be done? What kind of a 3D can do these things and not cost more? All right, so let's dig into that, that 3D. So we show here again this baseline picture with the injector as the star and this 3D, 2D area, growing plume. Basically, we're saying we need to be able to make 2D lines from this baseline 3D, and they need to be comparable to all these native sets of 2D lines that you might produce later, and they might not be a star pattern, they could be anything, so they have to we have to flexibly be able to produce 2D lines from these 3D, any number of them really. And so the key to doing this isn't the 2D lines, the key is that the 3D can produce them, and it produces them from a method that we call wave field reconstruction. So let's dig in a little bit on some of the questions around that. Some people might be asking, why is this such a big deal? After all, whenever geophysicists and geoscientists look at 3Ds, they extract transects, like lines of section, 3D transects from this 3D. It's done all the time. It's fundamental to the purpose of surveying, of interpreting those surveys. But the issue here is that we're not looking at a 3D transect. We're looking at a transect to be comparable to a 2D line for time-lapse, which is an entirely different thing than just pulling off any old transect. Such a comparison, if you just used a 3D transect and compared to a native 2D line, wouldn't work, because the 3D transect is 3D imaged. And the 2D line, those repeat lines we shoot later, they're 2D imaged 2D lines. That comparison will fail, which is why we have to do something called wave field reconstruction, something like a 5D interpolation type method, where we would reconstruct from the 2D all of these 2D lines, and then we would 2D migrate them. Which leads us to the fact, and hopefully this isn't too confusing, but it is kind of interesting, that we really have 3 kind of lines that we might think about. One is a reconstructed 2D line from the 3D. In wave field reconstruction, we make these 2D lines, we then 2D migrate them. They come out of the baseline. That's one kind of line. Another kind are all these little repeat 2D lines in whatever form they turn out to be, star patterns or something else. They're 2D lines. They're shot as 2D lines. We call them native 2D. And then the third kind is a 3D transect from the 3D. That's 3D migrate. And we mustn't mix up what is what. So there's reconstructed 2D lines from the 3D. There's native 2D lines that are repeats. And there's 3D transects. Okay. So on the other hand, there's the one hand we talked about, which is, why is this such a big deal, which we just explained. The other hand is, why should this work? This actually seems absurd. Why are we relying on 2D lines for monitoring? The history of seismic exploration and development, of seismic for monitoring and understanding the subsurface, is one of going from 2D to 3D, because 3D provides better imaging. But why isn't this ridiculous? It isn't ridiculous because we already have a baseline 3D. We already have our ship of Theseus. We aren't trying to float on a plank. Because we already understand from the baseline 3D what the subsurface looks like, what the structures are, how we can explore it with that 3D, we're not going in blind when we're relying on 2D lines for monitoring. And if you hearken back to the companion paper to this, also an e-poster, the Theseus one, we talked about how we have a ship of Theseus, that's the baseline 3D. And when we do monitoring, we're really talking about replacing planks on that ship. And that's what these 2D lines are. Okay. All right. So let's talk about our experimental procedure. How are we going to demonstrate that such a thing is possible and might actually work? First, we're going to build an Earth model, and we're going to build something that's appropriate to onshore. We're going to use Western Canada, and we're going to give it appropriate imaging challenges for that area. We're going to use 3D ray tracing to simulate the acquisition of a master 3D and a series of native 2D lines. And we're going to shoot these. Basically, we're going to shoot them with a computer. We're going to shoot them separately. And then we're actually going to process the 3D and the native 2D separately, just like we would with real data. So it's like a simulated experiment, except it's much cheaper and we don't cut down any trees. We're going to go ahead and attempt this experiment of producing reconstructed 2D, and we're going to compare that to the native 2D. Now, we talked about a master 3D. That's because the 3D that we're going to show can actually become a series of sub-3D geometries. So we're going to repeat this experiment for each sub-geometry. Because not only are we trying to show that such a thing as doing this 24D is possible, that we can produce these 2D lines out of 3Ds through reconstruction, we're also going to talk about what 3D design might be most appropriate. And so we're using something called a master 3D from which we can see a variety of different geometries. So we'll show that a little more in a second. Here is the master survey and the 2D lines. In this, sources are red dots or squares, and the receivers are little crosses. The source and receivers are separated by 50 meters, and the source and receiver lines are 350 meters apart. This 3D survey looks a little bit like an orthogonal survey, except the lines in each direction, north, south, and east, west, are both source and receiver lines each, which would not be the case in an orthogonal survey. Now, we also show two lines with a blue highlight. These are our native 2D lines, and there's a north-south line, which we call 2D line 1, and a diagonal line, which we call 2D line 2. So this is our experiment that we're going to shoot. And I mentioned that we're not sure the exact 3D design, so we shot this master 3D. Well, from that master 3D, we can perform, we can pull out sources and receivers and create subgeometries. And there's 4 of them here that we're going to look at. In the upper left corner, that's an orthogonal survey. Just beside it on the right is something we call parallel survey. On the bottom left is zigzag survey, and bottom right is kind of a brick pattern survey, which we call reverse zigzag. The thing about each of these different 4 subgeometries, they each have precisely the same number of sources and receivers in them. So they're shot for the same amount of effort. But which one of these will produce the best reconstructed 2D lines? And here you might be getting a bit of a notion why we put north-south native 2D line and a diagonal one, because seeing these 2 different kinds of lines creates a interesting reconstruction problem for each of these subgeometries. So this is an idea of what the experiment is going to look like a little further. But how about the Earth model? Okay, so our Earth model is basically a very common, represents a very common model for Western Canada, particularly Alberta, Saskatchewan, where we're looking at something called the basal Cambrian sand. It's a reservoir that sits on top of the Precambrian granitoid basement. The BCS here is 40 meters thick. The base of it is at 2,000 meters. So what we're going to do is we're going to spread this geology out. The ceiling complex is shown in green in this. It's a series of shales. But what we're going to do to create an imaging problem is we'll spread this geology out, and then we're going to add a series of Precambrian highs that we'll call monadnocks to the 3D model. So here is a picture of that 2D, 3D shoot that we're going to make with a series of highs, these monadnocks, that we're showing in colored blocks. And they vary in size so that we can ramp up the difficulty of the imaging problem. Now, these monadnocks, most of them, all of them but one, are 30 meters high from the Precambrian top. The very largest of them, which is 500 by 500 meters laterally, is 60 meters high. The rest of them are this 30 meters, and they go from this 500 by 500 down to a 50 by 50 meter size. And you can see that the 2D lines that we have are laid out so they hit these highs a bit differently. And in fact, line 2 just misses the corner of this largest of the monadnocks. So kind of a interesting little challenge, but one that is not inappropriate for this area. So we're going to go through the results of this experiment, both qualitatively and quantitatively. First, qualitative results. We'll show you the 3Ds first. We'll do this very quickly. So see a series of slides. They're all going to be set up the same. So what you're seeing in the lower left is an amplitude map taken along the Precambrian. Now, the Precambrian reflector ideally has the same amplitude everywhere. But whenever we have one of these monadnocks, because they have very steep sides, and this is the real world, we, right on the sides, don't pick up those amplitudes. So it means this amplitude map shows lower amplitudes right on the edges of these steep-sided highs. Okay? And the image on the right on this slide is north-south line 1. North is on the left, on the right, and south is on the left. And you can see that we follow the Precambrian. This pick is the pick in red, and generally speaking, it looks the same. But we note this is 3D migrated. This is a 3D transect. That's what kind of line we're looking at here. It should have the same amplitude everywhere, and we see that this migration does a very good job on the big monadnock. The 200 meter by 200 meter monadnock next to it does a pretty good job. See how there's no amplitudes underneath? Very little on the smaller one. When you get to the 100 by 100 meter monadnock, the amplitudes are not perfectly collected on the top, and we can see there are some erroneous amplitudes on the bottom, but nevertheless, we would still pick this correctly. So that's a 3D result, and this is the result of shooting the master 3D. So master 3D, now we're going to compare to the sub-geometries. We're going to do this quickly. First, the orthogonal 3D looks much the same, not too different, maybe not quite as good, but very similar result. So that's orthogonal. Now here is parallel. This is with the lines exactly parallel to each other. This result is clearly not as good. It's not as good in the amplitude map, and it's not as good in the section. The zigzag result with the zigzag geometry, it's actually a lot like the orthogonal. It doesn't have quite as good an amplitude on the top of the smallest of the monadnocks, but it's pretty close. And the reverse zigzag, that brick-like pattern, very similar to the orthogonal result. Okay, those are 3D transects. Now, what does that 3D transect look like compared to a native 2D line? We've been looking at line 1 so far, so let's keep our focus there. So the master 3D transect we're showing on this slide on the left. We looked at this line before. And on the right, we're showing what we're interested in, which is the native 2D line 1. And you can see that there are a bunch of arrows here. The arrows are pointing to things that aren't quite right. So if you compare the master 3D transect along line 1 to the native 2D line along line 1, we would conclude a couple of things. One is that the native 2D does not do as good a job at imaging. The top of these smaller monadnocks have too small of an amplitude, especially the smallest. And at the base of the monadnock, there's way too much amplitude. In fact, for this smallest monadnock, you might not actually pick it there if you didn't know it was here. This isn't a very good result for that 100 by 100 meter monadnock. Now, the reason for this is this native 2D line is 2D migrated, and it can't collect the non-specular energy from these small features and collect them and put them, image them correctly. So that's interesting. Nevertheless, this is our target, and it is indeed a strange world when we are trying to match something that's imperfect. Okay, but this is what we're trying to do. So now we're getting to the meat of the problem. We're comparing the reconstructed version of line 1 to the native 2D line. So this is reconstructed and 2D migrated. So the native 2D line is on the left. The reconstructed from the master 3D result is in the middle. And if we do a difference of these two, that's shown on the extreme right. Okay, so this is the result for the master 3D, and it's an excellent result. The master 3D reconstruction, it's a 2D line, looks just like the native 2D line. It is very similar. It's very similar in that it has precisely the same errors that the native 2D line did. The difference is very small. This is highly successful, and it tells us that this can work, that the 24D idea is possible. But we really don't want to shoot that master 3D geometry. It's very expensive. Which of the subgeometries can do a job like this? Here's the orthogonal result. It's very similar. There is a bit of a larger difference than the master had. After all, it was shot with more effort. It's better sampling. But it's a very good result, very similar. This orthogonal reconstruction of line 1 looks a lot like the native 2D line 1. How about the parallel result? No, the parallel result is very poor. And you can see that on the difference plot. It shows a lot of migration problems. The zigzag result is good. It looks a lot like the orthogonal did. Very similar looking results. And the reverse zigzag, very similar. Okay, that was line 1. Let's go through the same exercise for line 2. So line 2 is the diagonal line, which has the near miss to the largest monadnock. And we show the line here going from on the left is the northwest and the right is the southeast. You get just a hint of this near miss. And you can see these two monadnocks, the smallest of them, not perfectly imaged. And this is the 3D transect, so even it isn't perfect. But this gives us an idea of a very well imaged version of, line 2. Okay, so now we're going to compare line 2, the master 3D transect that we just saw, versus native 2D line 2 on the right. And these are quite different. We can see that underneath the two monadnocks, we've got lots of amplitudes that we shouldn't have. The amplitudes on top of the monadnock are too weak. And we also see where this red arrow is. You see this energy here. This is actually sideswipe off of the largest of the monadnock that we just missed. And we're getting this because we're using a 2D migration. This is a 2D line, and we've got basically offline energy that we can't handle in processing because the 2D experiment is inferior to the 3D. But this is, nevertheless, our target. So let's go through the same comparison we did for line 1, but now for line 2, where we compare the native 2D line 2 on the left, the reconstructed line 2 in the middle, and the difference on the right. And if you look at this first comparison is the reconstruction from the master geometry. The master looks really just like the native 2D line. It has a very small difference. How about for the subgeometries? The orthogonal geometry, very similar. The parallel geometry, not good. This, just like in line 1 for line 2, the parallel geometry reconstruction of line 2 is poor. The zigzag is good. It's a lot like the orthogonal. And the reverse zigzag is very similar as well. Okay. So you'll probably draw your own conclusions from what I just showed you. That's a sense of what qualitative is. But why don't we do some quantitative analysis? So this is objective comparisons of how well things compare. And we're going to do this in two ways. On the left, we're trying to explain how we'll use the actual pick amplitudes themselves to give us a measure of how well we're doing objectively. So what we're doing is we're going to take the Precambrian pick, that's the red pick, from the native 2D lines, line 1 and 2, and we're going to correlate those picks to each of the subgeometries, and we'll see how high the correlation coefficient is. So that's one objective measure. Another measure is we can look at all these difference plots that we've been observing. And so for each difference plot, we can take a window, we'll call it a 32 millisecond window centered on the Precambrian, and we'll take the sum of absolute amplitudes in a zone about that pick, and we'll just average them for the lines. So why don't we start with that? So the difference analysis, the average of the sum of absolute amplitudes of the difference plots are shown on this slide. And what you really want is a low average difference, relatively speaking. So if we see the lowest average difference is from the master 3D, but we're really comparing these other four. And from these other four, the orthogonal, the reverse zigzag, and the zigzag geometries all have about the same average difference. There's not much to pick these apart. The parallel reconstruction is not nearly as good. And I think, all would agree we saw that qualitatively. Now let's move on to correlation coefficients. So we're going to correlate the amplitudes along the Precambrian from the native 2D to each of the other 3Ds. And we'll show the correlation coefficients. So if we look at the correlation coefficient to the master 3D, that value is 0.995. It's a near perfect correlation. It's excellent. The orthogonal 3D, 0.98. The reverse zigzag, 0.977. And the zigzag, 0.973. These three are all very similar, and they're a very high correlation coefficient. This is sufficiently similar for time-lapse analysis. In other words, we would have succeeded in our goal of being able to show that 24D could work. And in fact, not only can 24D work, but it can work through a variety of geometries. Now, the parallel is much different. It's 0.878, and it is really, truly the odd man out. It is possible to shoot 3Ds such that this doesn't work. Okay. So let's sum up. First thing is the value of 3D is shown. 3D imaging is indeed better than 2D imaging. We saw some sideswipe effects in poor imaging from the smaller features on the native 2D lines and the reconstructions of them. We are not saying in any sense that 2D is better than 3D. It isn't, except it's cheaper. But we also see that most of the 3D designs that we used in this experiment, which is fairly close to noiseless experiment, they can create matchable 2D reconstructions for time-lapse. This can theoretically work. And really, on the good 3Ds, there was very little to differentiate the orthogonal zigzag and reverse zigzag. Only one 3D, the parallel, didn't work. So how about some, let's reach a little further in our conclusions to the realm of opinion from this work. And one is that it seems to us that a survey that's capable of satisfactorily meeting its needs of a baseline 3D, if it does a good job as a 3D, it may indeed produce satisfactory reconstructed 2D lines. So this is a good problem. Really, we want to take a 3D to the field that's a good 3D to act as a 3D to do all the things a baseline does. So it simplifies our problem. We want to shoot good baseline 3Ds. Another thing to point out is, although we showed that 2D imaging isn't as good as 3D imaging, that problem is not insurmountable. The same experiment that we did here that showed what images well or not is quite doable with any baseline 3D that you shoot in the field. You reconstruct, you create 2D lines, you could decide where to create those 2D lines and if they do a good enough job for imaging. So this problem with 2D, 3D imaging is definitely manageable. Okay. One last thing. The procedure that we went through here could also be used for 3D surveys that are already shot, legacy 3Ds. It can be used as a fitness test for repurposing for baseline for 24D for new carbon storage projects. I'd like to also thank Key Seismic, who did the modeling for us, particularly Aaron Stanton, Eric Sinetza, and Richard Bale. And I'll just remind you once more, if you look into the stack for this e-poster, there's a couple journal papers, and we go through some more of this in detail. Thank you.